Welcome to Creation in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Carl Baugh, founder and director of the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas. Now, today's program is one that you really need to listen to observe in every detail, and to retain, because it has to do with your frame of reference for life origins. Did you arrive here over long geologic periods of time in the history of fossils being buried by the billions over hundreds of millions of years? Or did you arrive recently as the product of a very special creation? Now, my guest on the program today is one of my very favorite guests, and he's been with us for a number of times. He actually drove 2 16-hour days to get here. He had to drive because of all these wonderful replicas and displays, and that's 4 8-hour days for the average driver. Would you welcome to your hearts and minds creation researcher and lecturer Ian Juby of Canada.
How are you today, Carl?
You're becoming almost a Texan by being here so often on the program.
Yes,
and doing research at Glen Rose.
Not that I mind.
We
like
don't
Texas.
mind at all. In fact, toward the end of the program, you'll be relating to us some specific work and research that you, Professor M.E. Clark of University of Illinois, et cetera, have done with us at Glen Rose.
Exactly, yep.
But before we get to new information, on a preceding program, you described the impact of these incredible nests of dinosaur eggs. By thumbnail sketch, we have millions of viewers watching the program who didn't watch the last program, so they should have been tuned in, I know. But for their sake, let's take time to at least give a thumbnail sketch of the importance of these eggs. What are these, Ian?
These are specifically, this is a reproduction of an Oviraptor dinosaur egg nest. Yes. Which, of course, was originally named Oviraptor for egg stealer, ova for egg, raptor for stealer.
But the paleontologists were wrong.
Yes, they found it in association with eggs, assumed, hey, survival of the fittest. It was out there stealing eggs for its food. Turns out later on they found an egg from another nest, the exact same egg, with a developed embryo inside it.
Yes.
It was an Oviraptor baby.
They were protecting the nest.
Exactly. It was probably the mother of that nest.
Yes.
That wasn't the only one. We've now found a second Oviraptor nest, and this time the Oviraptor was actually sitting on top of the nest, the entire thing buried together. Now, this is not evidence of long geological processes.
Is correct.
This is evidence of profound evidence of catastrophe,
yes,
and I would dare say Noah's flood.
Oh, absolutely, and we'll try to demonstrate that a bit later.
Yes, exactly.
Well, Ian, these are in pairs.
Yes, which is very interesting. It appeared to be that some of the dinosaurs were able to lay 2 eggs either at once, or perhaps had 2 oviducts with which to lay 2 eggs side by side.
Yes.
And it has been speculated the eggs were possibly cemented together with a mucus cement as well. But that's speculation. Nobody really knows. But the main point of this nest is this is what the dinosaurs want to do.
Yes.
They will stand in one central point, apparently, lay 2 eggs, then rotate their bodies, lay another 2 eggs, yes, rotate their bodies, lay another 2 eggs, rotate their bodies again around until they complete the circle.
And a beautiful symmetry at that.
Yes.
So we're not having chaotic disorientation, but designed orientation.
Yes, which is actually seldom what we see when it comes to fossil dinosaur eggs.
Yes.
Now, in this case, as we saw here, they would lay 2 eggs at a time. While they want to apparently lay them in a circle, this one from the Two Medicine Formation in Montana, it was a green-gray mudstone, much like this color. And apparently, my guess is the dinosaur laid the eggs on the run.
On the run.
What it was running from? Well, I would suggest it was Noah's flood.
Because there's evidence of sedimentary layering covering hundreds and hundreds of square miles.
Yes.
In fact, tens of thousands of square miles.
Tens of thousands. And this was...
This comes to the major impact.
Yes. Now, this one came out of China. This was apparently a hadrozaur dinosaur egg nest. Again, as I previously mentioned, Vance and I were discussing this. And it was Vance who pointed it out, and I hadn't thought of this till he mentioned it. Neither of us had seen a hadrosaur dinosaur egg nest that was laid in a circle like this.
Yes.
We've only ever seen clumps of dinosaur hadrosaur eggs. We're not experts, but Vance and I, we get around a lot.
Yes.
And Vance has seen Vance has seen a lot more dinosaur eggs nests than I have, but I've still seen my fair share as well. Neither of us have ever seen a hadrosaur egg nest laid in a circle like this. And interestingly, in this case, this one in China, the eggs were laid at different elevations.
Yes.
Which one implication is that as the dinosaur rotated around, laying its eggs in a circle, by the time it got to the last one, the sediment or the mud it was laying them in was actually rising.
Yes, and rather than run like the preceding one, there was no place to run to.
Yep.
So you gotta go, you lay the eggs, and what an incredible demonstration of the rising sedimentary deposit.
Exactly. Exactly.
And as you pointed out previously, it appears that this circle is the way the hadrosaurs, the honkers, desired to lay their eggs, even though this was in some peril and rising context, but laying them in clumps was again a desperate move.
Again, apparently. Probably laying the eggs partially to get rid of just the weight and the energy and the consumption. Now, another interesting point, some have suggested that when we do find dinosaur eggs with embryos in the eggs, that's a suggestion of long periods of time. Well, first of all, it's very interesting to note that finding dinosaur embryos is very rare.
Very rare.
Extremely rare, in fact, which right off the bat tells you something. The eggs that we find did not have a chance to incubate.
Yes.
And the few that we have found that apparently did have time to incubate can be explained by the dinosaur simply carrying the eggs in the oviduct until she can't carry them anymore, and she drops them.
Yes.
At which point the embryos have actually partially developed. This is known in some reptiles today. Some reptiles do
developed within the body of the mother. So here we have a nest of eggs that have a tremendous story, but they were caught in the flood.
Yes.
Now you have additional evidence that you've come thousands of miles to declare to us and to expose to this audience.
Yes. Now, we last week we finished off. Actually, if you wouldn't mind, just grab that poster and let's bring this over here with us.
Very good.
Because this is pertinent to everything we're about to discuss here. Now, again, we talked about Charles Lyell last week, and how he had proposed that possibly the land sinking or the water rising, either one could lay layers. He's absolutely correct. But his premise that you did not need a global flood to lay down the layers we see around the world was patently false.
That's correct.
And here's why. For instance, right here in Texas, we have the Austin chalk, which is all throughout here. And all this red overlay on this map indicates areas that are either covered with Austin chalk or believed to at one point been covered with Austin chalk, and it has now been eroded away. But as you can see, these layers encompass every single continent. So Lyell's premise is falsified, and you have one of two options. In either case, you have a global flood.
Either way.
Either all the continents subsided thousands of feet below the oceans. In other words, every single continent sunk simultaneously.
Major problem with that thesis.
Impossible tectonics. Impossible tectonics. Or the waters rose thousands of feet. In either case, you have a global flood. Now, interestingly, the Austin chalk as well has many of these fossil clams.
And for the audience, the Austin chalk is a layer of limestone, very hard limestone, that covers the area where we're excavating in Glen Rose, Texas. But you're saying, and advisedly so, that it really is global in nature.
Yes.
And that clam is in a unique posture.
Yes, and it tells a remarkable story. Now, 2 years ago, I carried out a study on the fossil clams within the Austin chalk. I looked at hundreds and hundreds of the countless millions of fossil clams down there, which are, like this one, buried in the closed position. It's intact.
And what does that mean, having been buried in a closed position?
Buried alive.
Buried alive, because there's a muscle here at the joint that relaxes when a clam dies, and the shells simply open. But they're buried in a living context, buried alive.
And furthermore, clams live in one of two positions. They either have a foot, which they anchor to a rock or whatever at the back here, or usually what they do is they will stand up in the mud. And they have a foot that comes out and they can push themselves along.
Yes.
And even when they push themselves along, they are still in the upright position. Of the hundreds I looked at, none of them were in the living position. They have all been tumbled and dislodged. None of them were anchored to anything. None of them were sitting upright. They were tumbled and dislodged. Again, evidence of profound catastrophe.
Profound catastrophe.
Not long and slow geologic processes. Yes. This wasn't some calm, placid sea as been suggested. Now, this is not the only layer with global ramifications. Now, if we can take... we'll stash that down here somewhere maybe. What we're going to do is we're going to take a short tour of the Grand Canyon because I want to bring home a couple of points here. Of course, we've all been to the Grand Canyon. Many of your viewers have. And the one point I want to make here, you'll notice all the layers within the Grand Canyon are parallel to each other. And it was actually George McCready Price who pointed this out and made a very significant point. You see, this is all supposed to represent hundreds of millions of years of geological deposition, long and slow, gradual processes. That's nonsense for a number of reasons. Polystrate fossils, as you previously mentioned, is one of them. But also, the land is not going to remain level for hundreds of millions of years.
Absolutely not.
It's just simply not going to. Now, if we take a look at this picture of the Grand Canyon here, you'll notice, again, in this area, this is off the North Rim, in that one area alone, within eyesight, you can see 10 miles wide of parallel sedimentary layers.
Yes.
Now, this is going to get a little complicated to explain, and I hope that these diagrams help. This represents the basement rocks, and this would represent the layers being laid down over hundreds of millions of years.
Okay, the basement rock being the granite.
Yes, granites, the schists, etc. So as the layers get laid down, well, over hundreds of millions of years, the land is going to tilt. I mean, you've got continents shifting and sliding, doing all kinds of stuff. So let's say the land tilted a mere 2 degrees. It is so slight you can barely even see it in this drawing. Again, layers continue to be deposited on top. And in this case, you can notice that the layer on your end is slightly thicker than this end.
Yes.
And again, it would continue up, and then you would have parallel layers again. If the land ever went out of level at any one point, you should see that. In this case, we only see it in this drawing in one layer, this beige layer. You should see a difference in the thickness on one end. That is not what we see in the geologic record. Mm-hmm. What we see very consistently is parallel layers.
Yes.
Now let's do a bit of math. Within the Grand Canyon, within a 10-mile span of eyesight, if we were to have the land even tilt 2 degrees, or forget 2 degrees, let's go conservative, 1 degree. If the land tilted even 1 degree during those hundreds of millions of years of deposition, then what we should see here is a difference in the thickness of at least one of the layers of up to 922 feet within eyesight of a 10-mile span.
Yes.
Now, to bring that home, the Redwall limestone is one of the thicker layers within the Grand Canyon. It's only about 500 feet thick. We should see the complete disappearance within eyesight of layers.
Yes.
Instead, what we see around the world is perfectly parallel layers. And many of these layers, such as the layers down at the bottom, you can barely see it in this photograph right here. On top of the basement rocks is a layer called the Tapeats sandstone. Now, it's very interesting. That Tapeats sandstone covers roughly 1/3 of North America. Now, down here, it's called the Tapeats sandstone. In the Midwest, it's called the Lamont sandstone. Up in Montana, it is called the Flathead sandstone. And that photograph, just to your right of your head, this is the granite basement rocks, and that is the Flathead sandstone. It is identical in every respect to the Tapeats.
This shouts for a flood of major proportions.
Major proportions. And it doesn't even end there. Up in New York, it's called the Potsdam sandstone.
Okay.
It outcrops in Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia as the Potsdam sandstone. Now, a number of years ago, John Mackay, when he was on a trip in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, found some fossil footprints in the Tapeats sandstone from a tetrapod. They should not be there. That's Cambrian rock. It's way out of place. However, 2 years ago, up in Kingston, Ontario, there is Postum Sandstone Quarry. Guess what they found in the sandstone?
Same thing.
Tetrapod fossil trackways.
Marvelous.
They are now
Marvelous.
considered the oldest tetrapod trackways in the world.
Well, for those not familiar with that terminology, what we're simply saying is massive burial grounds occurred rapidly with sedimentary deposit over vast areas.
Vast areas.
A global flood.
Exactly.
Back to the worldwide flood. Now, caught in that flood are certain creatures.
Many creatures. Now, we talked about Archaeopteryx the last time. If I can digress for a second. Actually, what I'll do is I'll discuss this very quickly, briefly. This is the Dinosaur National Monument. We've been there a number of times.
Many times.
You and I have both gotten to excavate within the Morrison Formation.
Certainly.
A number of times. And it's just a whole whack of disarticulated dinosaurs that have been ripped apart and buried together.
Yes.
Now, again, the most common fossil found in Dinosaur National Monument is not dinosaurs, it's clams.
That is correct. By the tens of thousands.
And they say this was the deposit of a slow meandering river. Let's examine that slow meandering river. If you go to the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta, I would encourage anybody to. It is phenomenal. You have this attempt to explain the mass burial graves that we see within the fossil record. This was a river in Quebec that overflowed its banks. Tons of various animals were buried together, and they say this is possibly what happened to the dinosaurs. Hey, I completely agree. However, this river was not some slow meandering river.
That is correct.
This is a map of the Morrison Formation. It covered 10 states and 3 provinces. This was not some meandering river.
That is correct.
This was thousands of feet above sea level, catastrophically burying all kinds of dinosaurs together. Now, we find dinosaurs buried in one of 2 ways: ripped to shreds, or in the death pose.
This makes a major statement.
Yes, and there was a fun little article. You and I talked about this on the show before, and I'm sorry, I hate to gloat, but I must, because I was very pleased to see an article come out by Kevin Padian and Cynthia Marshall Fox. And they came out with an article in Paleobiology in June of 2007 talking about this death pose, which is the head arched back as far as it can go.
Yes.
And sometimes the legs and sometimes the tail are also splayed. And to say that this is commonplace in the fossil record is an understatement. These are only a few of the examples. I've probably got 35, 40 examples in my collection now. This is from Vance Nelson's museum. This came from the Royal Tyrrell. This came from the
suffocation death pose.
And that is precisely their conclusion of the article.
Yes.
Because
a painful, suffocating death.
Exactly. Now, previously they had said, well, it laid out in the desert and the tendons dried and that pulled the neck muscles back. Nonsense. Because, for instance, the legs and tails weren't consistently affected as well. The best explanation was it was death throes. Kevin Padian and Cynthia Fox came to that conclusion by doing all the research I wanted to do years ago.
And they are standard paleontologists publishing in the standard literature.
Exactly.
Peer-reviewed literature.
And their conclusion was they were suffocated to death and buried rapidly. Very simple.
Incredible. The same is true with billions of fish. Some years ago, geologist Hugh Miller, published in the technical literature that billions of fish cover the British Isles, underlie the British Isles, with their backs arched, their gills distended in a death pose in suffocation context.
Yes, they didn't lay out in the desert and slowly shrivel up the tendons in the backs of their backs.
So again, they were caught in the flood. Not
Exactly.
a flood, the flood.
The flood. No.
You have done, along with your colleagues and Professor M.E. Clark, my favorite professor, you've done some research at Glenrose, which at this point is going to be exposed to a global audience. Tell us.
What we did is we had 2 flumes. We had a giant rotary flume, which many people who've gone to your museum have had the privilege to see. It was built by Professor Clark and H.D. Voss. We ran that several times. Now, unfortunately, my macro got turned off and I didn't notice. This is a polystrate worm in the sediments.
Yes.
What this flume does, we load it with water and sediment, we spin it up, and we let the water and sediments settle out and watch what happens. This dead worm wound up polystrate. And if you recall in the last program we did a few months back, We talked about polystrate fossil worms in the Paluxy and in the Burgess Shale in Canada, where there was 3 found.
Now we have produced a polystrate worm.
In the flume. All it took was moving water and mud. The worm wasn't even alive. It was dead. And lo and behold, it was polystrate. Now we built the linear flume in order to make a straight run of the sediments and water. We learned some remarkable things. Now, I'd like to introduce the viewers to a geological formation called crossbedding. So you have layers, such as you see here.
Yes.
And with
specific lines and layers.
And within those layers, you have tilted layers called crossbeds. And if you look real close, they have 3 parts. They have a top curve called the top set, a slope called the foreset, and the bottom curve that levels out again called the bottom set.
Yes.
If you go to Zion National Monument and various other places, such as the Coconino Sandstone, they say these were fossil desert dunes. Nonsense. Here is a desert dune. You'll notice the layers conform to the shape of the desert dune.
Yes. Yes,
this is
that's very obvious.
This is not crossbedding. This is waves. There's a difference. Now, I'm arguing that wind cannot produce crossbeds. However, in our flume, crossbeds were dead easy to make.
Oh, they're marvelous. They're so distinctive.
And all it took was flowing water, a sedimentary source, and standing water. And in this case, as you can see in this photograph, we didn't even have standing water. All we did was tilt the flume uphill 1 degree. So if the water is flowing uphill, you will get crossbeds.
Yes.
Because the water flowing in, carrying sediments, hits the standing water, comes to a stop, and drops the sediments just like a conveyor belt. Many have argued that because the crossbeds of Zion National Monument, etc., are so steep, they couldn't be made by water because water can't make crossbeds steeper than 10 degrees. Nonsense.
Well, 36.7 degrees. And
we're quite,
I was there observing this.
We watched it being made by water. In fact, water made the steepest slopes. We're pretty confident we could get up to 45 degrees if we pushed at it.
This is cutting-edge research, and it is a cutting-edge demonstration to a global audience that supports very rapid deposition, not long periods of time and when crossbedding, but instead very rapid deposition under the conditions we find in the worldwide flood. Now, did you produce some fossils?
Okay, we didn't exactly produce fossils, but we did get some newts, and we put them in a flume while we were making the crossbeds. The reason is these fossil footprints came from the Coconino Sandstone, which, like Zion National Monument, is heavily crossbedded. Now, within those crossbeds, on the slopes, you will see fossil footprints. Some very unusual characteristics about these footprints. They pretty much only ever go uphill. Now, our good anti-creationist friend Derek Ager, while he was still alive, claimed that this could be explained because only the footprints on the lee side of the sand dune would be preserved. Nonsense. That would mean all the animals in the desert were only walking in one direction at any time. It's nonsense.
Certainly.
I mean, for such a smart man to make such a silly comment has to make one ask questions. But furthermore, if you were to watch those footprints in a trail, literally within a few feet, they will go from very heavy footprints to lighter footprints to claws only, and then completely vanishing, all within only a few feet.
In rising water.
It's the only explanation.
It's the only explanation.
Because, I mean, the other explanations are silly. What, did it tiptoe through the desert? Did it grow wings and suddenly fly away? All other explanations are nonsense. However, in our flume, when we were producing the crossbeds, we put newts in the water to study their behavior. What they did, the water flowing in would hit the standing water and it would create an eddy right in this region, right here, and the newts would hang out in that eddy. If they tried to escape, there was only one way to go, and that was uphill against the current. They would be picked up by the water, carried away, and often would even get caught back in the eddy and swept right back to the exact same spot.
And you caught it on film.
We caught it on film. So all it takes, one salamander can make multiple tracks on multiple foresets for hundreds, maybe even perhaps thousands of meters. Who knows how far? Now, the last thing I want to close with as well, this comes from our good friend David Lyons.
Yes.
Another sand dune place is the White Sands in New Mexico. I stopped in there as well. And of course, if you look, it is heavily crossbedded.
Right.
Now, the thing is, they claim that the crossbeds are being formed by wind. No, they're being destroyed by wind. You can see the crossbeds here, and you can see that it is horizontal where it is being worked by the wind. Wind produces waves, not crossbeds.
Not crossbedding. What we have learned in this intriguing time together is that the scientific research properly carried out, properly documented, properly understood, points to a worldwide flood in which dinosaurs were caught in an egg-laying context, in which ultimately creatures, dinosaurs and fish and other creatures, were caught in a judgmental context in the throes of death with their necks arched for fishes. It was their back arched, gills distended, in a horrible and very rapid death. All of this is global in nature. It points to the worldwide flood. But now, you can escape the proper judgment executed against a sinful mankind by turning to the ark of refuge, Jesus Christ. Christ died for our sins, was buried, rose again, ascended, and now in a universal dimension is approaching every heart. As he approaches your heart right now, would you pray this simple prayer with me? Just pray this simple prayer. Dear God, I've sinned. I need Jesus Christ. Lord Jesus, right now, I open my heart's door to you. Right now, come in. Cover me with your blood, forgive my sins, and save me forever. And I will serve you with all my heart. Welcome home.
Creation in the 21st Century has been sponsored by Trinity Broadcasting Network. And only with your love gift of support can this program stay on the air. So write to Creation in the 21st Century, P.O. Box A, Santa Ana, California, 92711.
Creation in the 21st Century is a unique program on TBN combining biblical knowledge with scientific verification. Much of the information that I use on the program is available. Contact us. Just write Creation Evidence Museum, P.O. Box 309, Glen Rose, Texas 76043, or call us at 254-897-3200. We look forward to hearing